I heard my sister-in-law's voice before I could open my eyes. "She's still on the ventilator," she said quietly. "How long do we wait before we contact a realtor?" I couldn't move my hand. I couldn't turn my head. But I heard every word. "My name is Cassidy Oakes. I'm 31 years old. I'm a licensed insolvency trustee based out of Kitchener, Ontario, and the people standing at the foot of my hospital bed, deciding what to do with my house before I was even off life support, were my husband and his family. 6 weeks before that moment, I had been fine. Better than fine. I'd just closed out the most profitable quarter of my career. I owned a semi-detached in the East Side neighborhood I'd bought on my own at 27, before my husband and I even got serious. I had TFSA and RSP accounts I'd been feeding since I was 22. I had a life I'd built from scratch, the kind people told me I was too young to have. Then I collapsed at my kitchen sink on a Tuesday evening. A brain arteria venous malformation, the neurosurgeon would explain later. A tangle of blood vessels that had been waiting my entire life to rupture. Emergency craniotomy, medically induced coma. ICU at Grand River Hospital. My husband was named my substitute decision maker because we were legally married and my parents were in Kelowna and couldn't get there in time. That's all the access he needed. By the time I came out of the coma 12 days later, he had already called a real estate agent. He had already spoken to someone at my bank, not his bank, mine, about the joint access my emergency documents had granted him. He had already told his mother and his sister that my grandmother's sapphire brooch, the one I kept in the cedar box on my dresser, was going to be auctioned to help cover medical costs. My medical costs were fully covered. I have extended health benefits through my firm and a critical illness policy I took out when I was 26. He knew that. He'd been the beneficiary on one of them. But I didn't say any of that when I opened my eyes. I looked at the ceiling and I breathed, and I let them think I didn't remember what I'd heard. He cried when I first woke up. He pressed my hand and said I was so scared, and I love you so much, and maybe some part of him meant it. But I work in financial restructuring. I have spent my entire career watching people say the right things while their hands are doing something else entirely. I know what managed emotion looks like. I recognized it the second his eyes went to the door instead of staying on mine. I nodded weakly. I said I was tired. I asked for water. I asked about my house. "Oh," he said, like I'd asked about something trivial. "We're just making some adjustments, Cass. You don't need to worry about that right now. Rest." His mother smiled from the corner. She had never liked me. From the beginning, I was too independent, too career-focused, didn't defer to her enough at family dinners. My husband was her youngest and her favorite, and she had wanted him to marry someone softer. I smiled back. That night when the ward quieted down and visiting hours had ended, I asked the night nurse if I could have my phone to check on something work-related. She hesitated, then handed it over. I had maybe 20 minutes. I didn't call my parents. I didn't call a lawyer. I opened a secure app I use for client files, end-to-end encrypted, biometric access, nothing stored on the phone itself. And I logged into a remote monitoring system I had set up the previous year after a client's case involved a break-in and stolen documents. I had installed 2 small cameras in my house, one in the living room facing the front hallway, one in my home office pointing at the filing cabinet. The living room camera showed boxes, cardboard moving boxes, some taped, some open. My bookshelf had been cleared. The side table my grandmother left me was gone. The office camera showed my filing cabinet with the top drawer open. I stayed very still and breathed through my nose. Then I closed the app, handed the phone back to the nurse, said thank you, and lay in the dark until morning. He didn't know about the cameras. I'd never mentioned them. And he definitely didn't know about the crawlspace. When I bought my house, the inspection report flagged an irregular structure beneath the back half of the kitchen. A partial crawlspace that had been converted at some point in the 80s into a shallow concrete-floored room, accessible through a hatch under the utility shelving unit in my back hallway. Previous owners had used it for wine storage. The real estate listing didn't mention it. The hatch was behind the shelving unit, invisible unless you moved it. And I'd never moved it in front of anyone. 2 weeks after I bought the house, I hired a contractor through a professional referral, someone who'd done secure storage builds for a few of my higher-risk clients, and I had the space properly finished. Insulated, climate-controlled, with a keypad entry installed behind the hatch. I put a small fireproof cabinet in there. Inside it, physical copies of every important document I owned, an encrypted external drive, emergency cash, and my grandmother's original will, because I'd had a bad feeling since the reading, when my aunt had looked at me in a way I still couldn't quite explain. I hadn't told my husband about the crawlspace. I hadn't told anyone. When I was transferred out of ICU to the neurology ward, I had more mobility, more access to my phone. The first call I made, not to him, not to my parents, to my colleague Petra, who had been my closest friend since our tickling, was from the hospital bathroom with the tap running. I told her I needed a favor. I told her what I'd heard and what I'd seen on the cameras. I told her I needed her to call a specific name in my contacts, a civil litigator I'd worked with on a creditor protection case the year before, and I needed it done quietly. Petra didn't ask unnecessary questions. That's why I trust her. Within 48 hours, without telling my husband I'd done anything at all, I had retained legal counsel. He visited every day. He brought flowers twice. He told me not to stress about the house stuff, that he'd handled everything, that, when I was better, we could talk through the decisions he'd made. I smiled and said thank you. I asked about his mother. I asked about the weather. I watched his hands instead of his face. One evening he mentioned, almost offhand, that a few pieces of my grandmother's estate had been listed on an auction site to offset recovery costs. I nodded slowly. What pieces? I asked. Oh, he said. Just a few things. The brooch, a couple of the prints. He paused. Some of it wasn't really sentimental, Cass. It was just sitting there. My grandmother had specified the sapphire brooch by name in her will. She had given it to me at her kitchen table 3 years before she died, pressed it into my palm, and said, "This stays in the women's line." I had the will. I had a photograph of that afternoon. I had a card she wrote me. The brooch had been listed for $420. I kept my face completely neutral. I said I was tired and needed to sleep. He kissed my forehead and left. And I sat there for a long time in the quiet. There's a particular kind of grief that comes not from losing something, but from realizing you were wrong about someone. Wrong for years. It doesn't arrive loudly. It settles. Heavy and precise, like a stone placed on your sternum. I let myself feel it for exactly one night. Then I got to work. My lawyer, once retained, moved carefully and without any contact with my husband. We needed documentation first. I requested all transaction records from the joint accounts my emergency paperwork had given him temporary access to. He had moved a significant amount of money into an account I didn't have access to. Money that had come from a savings account in my name alone. He'd also been in contact with a real estate agent about listing my house, though no listing had gone live yet. That was important. It meant the house was still mine. What I needed from the house was behind that hatch. My lawyer contacted my husband's representation, because he'd quietly hired his own, which confirmed everything about a scheduled property assessment related to the ongoing recovery and estate planning discussions. That got him and his family out of my house for 3 hours on a Thursday afternoon. Petra drove me. I was still moving carefully, still got headaches if I turned my head too fast. But I walked up my own front steps with my own key and let myself in. The living room was hollowed out. Most of my furniture was gone. The walls had marks where the shelving had been removed. The kitchen looked untouched, mostly because there was nothing valuable in it. But the back hallway was clear. The utility shelving had been moved, probably when they were looking for storage space for boxes. The hatch was visible, but the keypad was still there. Still locked. They hadn't touched it. They hadn't known what it was. Probably assumed it was some kind of old utility panel. The code was a date no one in my life would ever think to try. I knelt down on the hallway floor in my coat and I opened it. Everything was exactly where I'd left it. My grandmother's original will, my RRSP and TFSA statements with my name alone as account holder, the deed to my house with my signature only. He was never on the title because we'd kept our finances separate, something he'd agreed to at the beginning of the marriage and apparently regretted only when it became inconvenient. Copies of my critical illness policy and my extended health benefits package. The external drive with 7 years of personal financial records, and a sealed envelope I had put there 2 years earlier, during a period when something had felt off in the marriage. I couldn't name it then, just a feeling. An envelope labeled "in case" that contained a detailed accounting of every asset I owned, individually. Every account, every policy, with instructions to my lawyer on file about what to do if I ever became incapacitated and anyone tried to challenge my financial autonomy. I'd forgotten I'd put it there. Sitting on the hallway floor in the house that was still technically mine, I opened the envelope and read through what I'd written to my future self. I had known something, even then. Some quieter version of me had known and had prepared anyway. I put everything in a bag, locked the hatch, stood up slowly, and walked back out. The civil case was filed the following week. Fraudulent conversion of personal property, unauthorized access to sole ownership financial accounts, misrepresentation of expenses to family members to solicit financial support. That last one came from something Petra found. He had sent a message to a family group chat saying my medical costs were catastrophic and asking whether anyone could contribute. 3 relatives had sent money totaling over $9,000. My bills were already settled. His lawyer tried to reframe everything as good faith spousal decision-making under crisis conditions. It was a reasonable argument, and I understood why they made it. But good faith decision-making doesn't involve moving money into separate accounts at 11 o'clock at night. It doesn't involve auctioning items explicitly named in a will, and it doesn't hold up against a critical illness policy document showing a zero balance owing, timestamped 6 days before the family group chat message was sent. Bank records don't have motives, they just have timestamps. The mediation hearing lasted 4 hours. His family sat on one side of the table. My lawyer and I sat on the other, and I watched his mother's face as document after document came across. She had been so certain. Right up until she wasn't. Full restitution of the transferred funds. Return of the sapphire brooch which had not yet sold. Repayment to the 3 family members who donated under false pretenses. That condition came from my side and I insisted on it. A separation agreement initiating divorce proceedings. But that wasn't the end of it. When my lawyer reviewed the original terms of my grandmother's estate, the will I'd kept in that crawl space, she found a clause my grandmother's solicitor had inserted that none of us had paid close attention to at the time. A spendthrift provision tied to a secondary trust that held a small piece of property in Prince Edward County. The clause specified that if any beneficiary's spouse or partner attempted to access, liquidate, or misrepresent inherited assets during a period of the beneficiary's incapacity, that spouse or partner would be permanently excluded from any future claim under the estate, including claims that might otherwise arise through matrimonial property law. My grandmother had been widowed twice. She had watched money disappear both times. She'd built that clause in quietly, without making a fuss about it. The way she did everything. The cottage in Prince Edward County, modest, weathered, right on the water, had been left jointly between me and my cousin. Under normal circumstances, my husband might have had a matrimonial interest in my share after enough years of marriage. He had none now. My cousin called me the night my lawyer explained it. "Your grandmother," she said, and then she didn't finish the sentence, and neither did I. And we just sat on the phone for a moment. My husband tried to call me once, a few days after the mediation. I saw his name on the screen, and I let it ring. He left a voicemail. He said he panicked. He said he didn't know what he was thinking. He said he loved me and that this wasn't who he was. Maybe that last part is even true. I'm not the right person to measure it. What I know is that when I was unconscious and could not speak for myself, the person who had promised to protect me made a series of deliberate decisions, each requiring effort, each in the wrong direction. Panic doesn't move money at 11 at night. Panic doesn't research auction platforms. Panic doesn't draft a message to a family group chat asking for financial help while the insurance paperwork is sitting in the kitchen drawer. I didn't call back. I'm back in my house now. The living room is still mostly empty. I've been replacing things slowly, buying what I actually want instead of what we'd compromised on. The kitchen looks the same. The utility shelving in the back hallway is back against the wall. The hatch is locked. I have coffee every morning at the island, and I watch the light come through the east window, and I think about my grandmother pressing that brooch into my hand and not explaining why she needed me to keep it safe. She knew things could be taken. She knew you had to prepare before you needed to. She also knew that a lock you install quietly, before anyone thinks to look, is worth more than 1,000 words after the fact. I kept the crawl space. I'm not putting it on any listing.